Hello, my name is Russell Myers. Welcome to Issues Unite. So, the financial papers and the mainstream media keep on pushing this thing that Evergrande is this, event, this influence that is basically going to cause the financial industry to collapse. This is a farce. This is an excuse. Uh, you know, I've been saying for many years that the next financial collapse, which is going to be the biggest in history, uh, in world history, is this has been planned for many years. It's intentional, and now you're hearing every excuse in the book that about this. They're claiming that workers demanding more pay is going to, destroy the economy when the opposite is true. They're making claims that, the pandemic is going to make everything collapse. Yeah, fewer people are working, but what does that mean? That means that overall, in spite of what they're saying, demand has fallen. Consumer spending over the holidays was the lowest it has been in years. It declined. It did not increase. And yet they keep on claiming demand is up, and you're paying higher gas bills because of the higher demand on gas and utilities, and that none of that is true when you're reducing, manufacturing and transportation and all this stuff. You reduce the demand for fuel and so forth. But let's get into Evergrande and let's understand the difference between how this is playing out in China as opposed to how it would play out if it happened in the West, especially America. One of the first things to understand is that if this happened in America, let's say it happened to who is that? BlackRock or Blackwater? I get them confused. Sorry, but if that was happening to them, then chances are already by this point the U.S. government would have stepped in to bail that company out. But I'll go further into that. All right. One of the first things you have to understand is whatever company, doesn't matter. In this case, I'm using Evergrande as an example. There are other Chinese, real estate companies that are also, struggling right now. All right. But okay, why are they in debt? To whom are they in debt? In what manner? First of all, okay, so they issue bonds. One thing I have not looked into is, are the stockholders in these companies getting paid dividends, which would increase their debt even further? I haven't looked into that, but they issue bonds. Who buys the bonds? Okay. Individual domestic Chinese investors, foreign investors, such as American investors, and the major one is the Chinese banks. All right. So the Chinese government has already said that housing is for people to live in. It is not for speculation, as opposed to the United States. If Evergrande goes under, the Chinese government may very well step in and either save the company or nationalize the company. Even if they step in, it's going to be with extreme government oversight so that this doesn't happen again. They're going to change the entire business model of the company so that this cannot happen again. But most likely, they will nationalize it. All right. So most of the bonds that they issued were bought up by the Chinese banks. And, all right, so the banks issue the mortgages to the homeowners. The banks buy up the bonds. And they may issue loans to the company. Well, now you got to look at the difference between China and the United States and the banking structure in relation to the government. The Chinese banks are almost all state-owned. They are owned by the Chinese government. The fact is, if Evergrande goes under, the Chinese banks, with the approval of the government, can simply write off the debt that the company owes. That won't affect the homeowners whose agreement is with the bank, not the company. So it's not that the homeowners owe Evergrande. The homeowners owe the banks. The company owes debts on bonds that they issued. So even if the government writes off the debt, the homeowners get to stay in their homes. Compare that to the 2008 housing crisis in the United States. And what happened there? Over 5 million families, not 5 million people, 5 million families got evicted from their homes, foreclosed on, and that crashed the housing market. And what was the result of that is that ever since then, wealthy people have, and corporations like Blackwater, have been buying up properties across the country, especially in the last 2 years, at low prices until recently. This has been a gradual thing. It didn't all happen overnight. Whereas if this happens in China, people are not going to be evicted from their homes. Look at what is happening right now with the eviction crisis that is going on in the United States. That's not happening over there. It's not going to happen over there. Anyway, so if the government does step in, chances are, for diplomatic reasons, the Chinese government will pay out, possibly at a reduced rate, the bonds to foreign and probably domestic investors. So that would keep their economy from collapsing. That would keep diplomatic relations on an even keel. So going back to the 2008-2009 housing crisis, financial services crisis, financial market crisis, you look at what happened at the same time that 5 million families were being evicted from their homes. The government stepped in and bailed out who? The banks. In China, there's basically no reason that they have to bail out the government has to bail out the banks, because the banks are the government. yes, they will probably bail out the banks, but they will take a completely different route to do so. They will, like I said, just write off that debt. You look at how the Federal Reserve has been printing money. Well, the Chinese banks can do the exact same thing, and by the same token, they can erase that money, make it just no longer exist. Our entire financial system is built on fantasy. This money is created out of thin air, and it can go back to thin air. That is a possibility. That can happen. You're trading fantasy for fantasy. Your U.S. dollar is not an asset. It is an IOU. You look at your dollar, and it is an IOU printed by the government. I owe you this. It used to represent that you owned this amount of gold when we were on the gold standard, but now it doesn't represent anything. Whereas China has been building up their gold reserves, so, the Chinese yuan actually means that you own a part of the national wealth. There are a lot of people talking about the, housing market, the real estate market in China making up so much of the Chinese GDP. I've explained before how GDP is a useless number unless you look at it in relation to other numbers such as debt to GDP. Now, I'm not sure what China's debt to GDP is now, but 2 or 3 years ago it was 14%. Whereas right now at the United States, debt to GDP is in excess of 135%. That means that as a nation, we owe more money than we have, more money than we earn as a nation. So when you talk about this, even if they wipe it out, okay, if that takes up 20% of their GDP, they go from 14% up to 35% debt to GDP. That means they're still earning 65% on, as opposed to their debt. Whereas if you added another 20% to the U.S. debt to GDP and stretched it from 130% to 150%, that means this country is deep underwater. And, again, the government would step in to bail out the banks, not the homeowners, not the residents. So people are already being evicted, and more are going to be evicted, especially when winter ends. You can count on it that the eviction moratorium is going to absolutely cease to exist as spring comes in. The only reason they're doing it they're continuing it right now, is for political reasons. They may extend it further because it's a midterm year. Or they'll just make up excuses on why they can't and why you need to vote for Democrats because, the Republicans oppose, bailing out the homeowners or Manchin and Sinema are opposed to this, whatever. They'll come up with one excuse after another. But what you're hearing with Evergrande, with the pandemic, with rising wages, with the supply chain crisis, which again I have shown is pretty much another farce. You know, there is no shortage of consumer items when it's all sitting in containers on the West Coast or on ships off the West Coast that have come from China. And China's already been paid for everything that's on those ships. Their GDP last year still increased over 2020. And in 2020, it actually increased over 2019. So you can stop listening to all of that. It's all a game. Anyway, these are things to think about. These are things to be aware of. When you hear all of this scaremongering about Evergrande, just ignore it or throw these facts back in the person's face that's spouting it. All right. I got to get dressed and get on the road. So please share this video. Talk about these subjects. If you can, please donate $1 a month to help expand the channel, and I will catch you in the next one.